Could you just walk us through what's happened in the Chinese AI ecosystem?
The Chinese government, I think, post-reform era, hardware over software.
What's the general attitude of like Chinese founders and builders?
The main focus is a kind of competitive pressure one to stay alive. China's never stopped, right?
I remember this whole debate of like, even make a good model given the type of censorship you'd have to do.
If you can figure out how to make a model not racist, you can figure out how to have it not say politically controversial things.
So what role is the Chinese government playing?
The story of the Chinese government with respect to AI has been...
Jordan Schneider is one of the preeminent thinkers around China, hosting the popular blog and podcast China Talk. I'm Jacob Effron, and today on Unsupervised Learning, I sat down with Jordan, who's also been a close friend for about 15 years. We had a really interesting discussion. We hit on the Chinese AI ecosystem overall, some of the key players and trends and what's going on. We talked about the Chinese government and their attitude toward that ecosystem and how they're supporting it. And we talked about US policies toward China. We got Jordan's take on a bunch of the key questions around chips being debated right now. And like any good conversation with Jordan, we had about 15 tangents in between. Overall, a really fun episode. I think folks will really enjoy this. Without further ado, here's Jordan. Jordan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
What a pleasure, Jacob. Long time coming. 15 years in the making.
I know.
We are.
Who would have thought, 6-7 years ago when I went into venture and you started like this China newsletter that we would have a joint podcast?
I did.
You saw this day?
Of course. I've been waiting for it ever since we revived a failing college politics magazine together.
That is true. Still a career highlight.
Indeed.
Maybe we can get the Yale Politic to cover this episode.
You think they'll sponsor us?
Yeah. Maybe a little ad or something.
Sure. Hi, guys.
Well, very much looking forward to having you on. We have not done a bunch of China stuff on this podcast to date, so I think you will be our resident expert for our audience. I'm going to kick things off in like the most broad way possible. Could you just walk us through what's happened in the Chinese AI ecosystem pre-ChatGPT and post-ChatGPT?
Pre-ChatGPT, we had a Chinese AI ecosystem which was doing AI not in the sort of like LLM scaling laws paradigm. There was a lot of sort of vision stuff which was world-class. And, the inklings of beginnings on robotics models, but the sort of scaling is all you need, transformer architecture paradigm, which brought us OpenAI and Anthropic and ChatGPT and the world that we've been living in for the past 3 years, was not something that really anyone in a Chinese technology company was investing a lot in. So it was a real wake-up call for the Chinese technology ecosystem with sort of lots of hand-wringing, but also kind of energy and excitement and funding that this sort of broader technology ecosystem, which was really desiccated in the wake of COVID and the techlash and crackdown that you saw really from like 2018, 2019, all the way through the fall of 2022, on the one hand was very freaked out that like America had this incredible, cool thing that China didn't, but also there was enough capital, talent, compute energy in order for lots of experiments to be started. So over the course of 2023 and 2024, you had a number of labs spin up. I think probably like 12 or 15 if we really want to like expand the bubble of like who was credible.
And how much of a coordinated effort was that, like top down versus like, hey, there's just a lot of talent?
So the interesting thing about the Chinese government and Xi in particular, but the Chinese government, I think really over, post-reform era, hardware over software. So software innovation, software companies were not conceived by the central government as like contributing to national power and national greatness. And the sort of reason that you had the techlash and all this drama with Ant Financial and DD getting smacked down and whatnot was because at the end of the day, the Chinese government did not see software-led companies as like really doing all that much fundamental to make China flourish in the way that the party envisioned it doing so.
Well, it seems like they thought it was actually bad for society.
That these great engineers working on algorithms and models are wasting their time rotting our children's brains when they could be, designing cars and weapon systems and what have you. So the 2023 sort of expansion was a fascinating one because it was almost entirely sort of private money driven, where you had these VCs who like were really just sad. There are all these like tearjerker articles about, oh, we have nothing to invest in, we can't raise our next round. It's like, okay, we have a new story to tell. And because the Chinese government very early on banned Western closed models from getting deployed within China, you have this protected market, which is a dynamic we've seen in many other sort of big corporate stories over the past 30 years in China. So I would say that there has been an enormous amount of Chinese subsidization and support on the hardware side, trying to build a kind of separate and resilient ecosystem away from the sort of like TSMC and Tokyo Electron and ASMLs of the world into something that China wouldn't be vulnerable to from an export controls perspective, to the tunes of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars over the past 15 years. But on the sort of software side of things, like very little. And it from a financial perspective, it started to be on the margins, but like DeepSeek and Alibaba Qwen and Minimax and Kimi are not Chinese government innovation stories. They are Chinese engineering, Chinese private capital, Chinese like big software companies that got hated on for the past 5 years stories, just being able to do their thing and ultimately deliver models which are competing globally.
Were these efforts like venture funded? Because obviously you had these big companies that like did, that produced these models. And then my impression of DeepSeek was like some hedge fund that like started doing these things. What is the story behind a lot of these like major Chinese players that we hear about?
So it's all of the above. DeepSeek is this weird exception of this guy who ran a hedge fund who just thought models were cool. He was sort of like Zuckerberg, and he just like bought a lot of Nvidia chips before they became impossible to buy. And he had a team that was sort of working on this. And then they ended up, going from spending time making like high frequency trading models to large language models. Alibaba, China's biggest cloud provider, owns the largest kind of e-commerce platform in China, also a big payments business, a big sort of like finance business as well on the side of it. They were working, had enough computer science talent, brought in a lot more other big companies like ByteDance, which, you guys know what TikTok is, had talent and capital and compute. There are a handful of smaller models which did raise VC funding. I think having, there were a handful of folks who had a pedigree from, having worked in Western labs primarily. There's a big kind of US-China knowledge interaction transfer, which we can get into. But yeah, you saw raises of, not like OpenAI and Anthropic raises, but 8 figures, like low 9 figures, to try to spin up something with like business model TBD, but like let's just go train some stuff, we'll figure it out on the backside.
Sounds familiar. I mean, obviously in the US, the version of these has been folks that were in the big labs, a lot out of like DeepMind or Meta or OpenAI or Anthropic, and they spun out and they start these new labs. Like the set of people that are at the forefront of the model development ecosystem in China, do a lot of them have Western experience? Is it just like, hey, once, it became clear to scale transformers, like there's certainly plenty of great engineers over there that have been messing with this stuff? Like who are a lot of these people?
Both. So we have folks with PhDs at Carnegie Mellon, folks who've spent time in Microsoft and Google. DeepSeek is an interesting exception where the sort of lore is that his English wasn't even good enough to like get into the top grad schools in China. So like, yeah, he wasn't about to move to the US, and sort of made a point of only hiring domestic talent because he thought it was kind of underpriced in the marketplace. But, if you go through the background of a lot of these top researchers, like the way they establish their credentials, both to the large kind of established tech firms that want to hire them, as well as the funders who they need to raise money from, is by having some sort of kind of Western big tech or Western academic credential. Though this is changing. And I think sort of one of the remarkable things of like, you've had a lot of young researchers on your podcast is this isn't necessarily a field where you need to have spent 20 years in it to be on the frontier. This was one of the the open questions that some people, but not China Talk readers, had over the course of the past 5 years is like, can Chinese engineers do it? Are they creative enough? Are they lateral thinking enough? And it's like, yeah, they can. It's a big country. They got a lot of really smart folks. And by the way, if you look at a lot of these Western labs, like a third of the last names are Chinese. And those Chinese, of that third, I would say 2/3 or 3/4 of them grew up in mainland China. So there's just an enormous amount of cultural exchange, intellectual exchange, academic exchange, which is happening before and continues to happen, even or despite all of the kind of geopolitical tension that's being spun up because of all of this.
That like research collaboration, do you expect that to continue? What's in the tea leaves there?
We'll see, man. I'm going to NeurIPS next week, which is in San Diego. This year is the first year they've had to spin up a second offsite one in Mexico, basically because Chinese researchers struggled to get visas to the most important AI research conference in the world. And that, I think, is like emblematic of a lot of the sort of larger challenges that these two ecosystems are, have today and will continue to have to like play nice. I mean, we are not in a sort of like perfect open free market. This is a dual use technology. This is the story of the decade when it comes to economic growth.
I guess going back to your timeline, it felt like with DeepSeek and then afterwards, there's been this collective movement in China of open sourcing models.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Hey everybody, I'm Anne Maris Walton, and I'm the new producer of Unsupervised Learning. Today, I'm super excited to introduce a new concept to the show, where we open up the floor to you. If you have any pressing questions about the AI ecosystem that you'd want to ask Jacob and an upcoming guest, please submit them using the Google form that's listed in the show notes below. We're super curious to hear about what you have to say and very appreciative of your support of the show.
There's been this collective movement in China of open sourcing models.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
It's a good question, because as you can tell better, as you know better than I do, it's hard to make money when you're not selling a thing, right? So I think from the beginning, it was a sort of market adoption play and a bit of a race to the bottom play where like if there was a really good model that was open source and free, it would be really hard to sell a closed model, which was not all that much better. And in the US, you did, over the past 3 years, really have a considerable gap where if you wanted to have access to the best capabilities, you could pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, Meta tried the strategy and then backed out, right? It just didn't work.
I think a few things happened. So like the technology ended up working out that you could get really good, pretty close stuff without having to spend tens of billions of dollars on training runs, which is something that made it easier for the Chinese players to take this, to be able to sell stuff which was like pretty good and still usable in this paradigm. All the firms are trying to make money. Yeah. Like we had the 1 year of fun research, let's just do stuff, and now there's starting to be more of a crunch. Our 15 AI labs that we started with are now down to like really 5 or 6. And most of them are sort of either like DeepSeek is an exception, but most of them are sort of like aligned with either Tencent or Alibaba. And then the sort of the applications and use cases are much more straightforward. Like, yeah, if you are Amazon, you want to have a model, so ChatGPT doesn't take over like the whole buying ecosystem. That's sort of the same thing from the Alibaba perspective. And OpenAI has not really been born in China. It's still like a few small players who are futzing around and making pretty good models, and a handful of giant companies who can pay for this because like they have other businesses which make enormous amounts of money and spin up enough cash for them to, stay relatively close to the frontier.
Right. But I mean, to your earlier point, it seems like to the extent that similar use cases to the US will exist in China, and the fact that these closed source models are banned in China, there feels like a large market. Like, do you expect the Chinese LLM market to kind of shake out similarly to the way the US one has?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think it hasn't, because we don't have AI labs that are strong enough to stand on their own. And I think that is sort of like, this comes back to like a fundamental difference between the sort of broader Western ecosystem and the Chinese one is there's just more VC money sloshing around in order to scale up an OpenAI or an Anthropic to be able to compete with the likes of a Google, right? And what we've now seen in China is like, we'll see. Maybe some of these smaller labs will try to go public and raise a lot of money, but the sort of relative independence that, not really Anthropic, because they're kind of like, beholden to a lot of these other players, but OpenAI has been able to develop over the past 3 years is not something that's happened to any of the players who've entered over the past few years in China.
Right. Well, does the Chinese government just, sit on the sidelines and be like, hey, let this develop as it develops? Like, I imagine there's a huge incentive to concentrate compute, concentrate talent, like really get something state of the art, or what's their attitude toward this stuff been to the extent?
Yes and no. I think it's working pretty good. If you're on the Chinese side, like, look, pre-training is nice. But by the way, the Chinese firms can still access compute abroad, and the best, and sort of use the best Nvidia chips. We have this famous Oracle basically powering all of ByteDance in America, which is maybe the story that's gotten the most headlines. Yeah. But the compute constraint is as much one of capital for now as it is like a coordination problem. And there's lots of downsides to like putting your thumb on the scale and saying you're the lab that we want to have win it all. And really what we've seen over the course of how the Chinese government has sort of shepherded the growth of other emerging technologies and industries is they're fine to have companies fight it out for a while, right? Like BYD was not anointed. Huawei was not anointed. They had to like battle for a decade, in Huawei's case, like multiple decades before they sort of rose to national champion status. So we're still in the early innings on that phase. And I don't think the technology today is quite the sort of AI 2027, like one run to rule them all. And if you don't get it, you're going to be lost forever. It's a much more dynamic ecosystem. As a repeated game. We're still figuring out the business models even, much less like whether or not AGI will be achieved once I collect enough chips in a basement.
What role is the Chinese government playing? You alluded to, like, obviously very focused on the hardware side, super involved in chips and reducing dependencies there. Anything else they're kind of like focused on?
People probably heard of America's AI Action Plan. Like China had a version of it. It's all kind of like fine, not super dramatic. Yeah, we're going to do more AI in education. We're going to do more AI in healthcare. We think open models are cool.
They also have like relatively meaningless platitudes in their government docs.
Oh yeah. 70% adoption in all companies by 2035. Like, okay, cool. That seems like a nice idea. One of the sort of like risk vectors that people were talking about was that the Chinese government would be really scared of what these models would produce and then kind of like crack down on folks' access to it because they're worried they'd be making.
I remember this whole debate of like if you could even make a good model given the type of censorship you'd have to do.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know. They figured out how to censor other stuff. How racist is Claude? Not that racist. If you can figure out how to make a model not racist, you can figure out how to have it not say politically controversial things, which, by the way, are like 0.0001% of queries. People are asking what basketball shoes to buy, not what happened in their country in 1989, primarily. So yeah, it's been much the sort of the story of the Chinese government with respect to AI has been more about how they, I think, have like. Maybe learn some lessons from the heavy hand that they put on the semiconductor ecosystem. That was very rocky. At one point, they jailed everyone who was running the most important sort of industrial policy big funds. When was this? 2021, 2022 or something. Yeah, so they had like $100 billion fund, and the top 7 people have now been disappeared for corruption. Right. The reporting is that was downstream of Xi being frustrated about the relative amount of progress that the indigenization has been made. And like, look, if the VC firms are going to put up the money, you can spend it on other things. So yeah, it'll like there's more downside than upside risk, I think, for the like Eye of Sauron to come on this. And for whatever reason, it's been pretty low touch for now.
from published documents or anything else, you can get a sense of like how worried is the administration about this?
It's really funny. So the Chinese system, I mean, really since Mao, has done these things called like study sessions, where they literally like sit around, bring in the top experts and academics, and like quote unquote learn about a thing, like have a lecture series, like ask questions. They had an AI one in May. We wrote it up. We'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah.
You can kind of triangulate what exactly they're focused on by like which guests they bring in to talk about them. Pretty anodyne people, not very crazy things. AI is important. We need to care about it. Not a ton of AI doomerism. I think there's like...
Is there like a Chinese Eliezer, or like, do they have that ecosystem?
No, I mean, the thing about like the right lens to understand the Chinese government's approach is, what is it going to do to national power, and what is it going to do to political stability? And I think there is a sort of broad understanding that the sort of social dislocation that this technology could potentially produce with job displacement is like an opportunity and a risk, and like we'll see how it plays out. It's not hitting as hard as what sort of reforms in the early 90s with state-owned enterprises did, for instance. So I think they're relatively confident in their system's ability to kind of absorb that dislocation that will come from the productivity growths. And on the like AI doom or safety side, not a lot from the government perspective. A line here or there. You see the sort of level of pilledness of various founders is interesting.
Yeah.
One of the top AI people at Alibaba, he just talked about AGI for 30 minutes at their like big annual conference. It wasn't anything novel or interesting compared to what you would see in the like. It's like very, very analogous to what you would see in the discourse in San Francisco. But it was remarkable that it happened from such an established player of like talking about, grand vistas of like new scientific opportunity and whatnot. So there is a real interplay in the discourse, I think, much more from the sort of private sector founder perspective. They all listen to Dwarkesh and Jacob's show.
I do say I'm always there. Someone will occasionally send me like a Chinese translation of one of our episodes, and like it does some real numbers. Like I'm shocked at how much people in China seem to follow along with like the discourse and like media here around AI in the US.
And this is one of the like perennially frustrating things for me is in the other direction. Like there's like 10 of us really whose job it is to like do the translation in the other direction and follow the Chinese AI ecosystem and explain it to the US. Whereas in China, like, I'm glad that's happened. But like, there's entire media organizations that are following what's happening in Silicon Valley, like translating the interviews, writing lessons. And that just doesn't happen in the US for various structural reasons, which we can delve into or not. The looking glass is very much one directional.
Yeah. What's the general attitude, of like Chinese founders and builders toward like, I mean, as they're consuming that content, is there this feeling of like a race, or is there a feeling of like excitement and we're all collectively trying to build this technology? I'm sure it's not as simple as any of that. But.
Look, I think the main focus is a kind of competitive pressure one to stay alive in this like incredibly hardcore like technology and commercial competition, both in the big companies as well as in the small ones. Like, it's been funny seeing this mirroring of like all the AI labs, they're now working 996. Like China's never stopped, right? And I think every time there is a big opportunity, the competition is just even more fierce, and there's less breathing room for these labs to survive. So that is probably comprises like 90% of the day-to-day worries. I think there is a broader sense, and you can read this in some of the DeepSeek founders' interviews, that he does feel like he's on this like humanistic quest to like, create a new technology and open like new vistas of science and innovation, which is nice. But there's also this very frustrating backdrop, which I think is probably best exemplified by a John Ewing anecdote. So he was the ByteDance founder. His old social media posts from like the late 2000s, early 2010s made clear he's liberal, like he's frustrated with censorship and whatnot. And he was kind of running, basically running a media company. Like he had like a BuzzFeed equivalent if BuzzFeed like was big and good and tech enabled. As TikTok in China, Douyin was growing. He and his leadership team like disappeared for a few days, and then at like 5:12 in the morning on like a Monday, he posts a letter, which is basically an apology, saying we did a bad job of moderating our content. We need to like serve the party better. We're not upholding socialist values, and this sucks. So there's this like really tragic like central tension is that a lot of the leading lights of the Chinese technology ecosystem do have this global liberal perspective, oftentimes have worked in the West or in Western countries, aren't, really all about like making the CCP great again, and, have kind of like, globalist in the nice cosmopolitan, let's say, visions of what they produce can do, but they're living under a system and in a sort of like global state of things where it doesn't matter what they think. So, as this technology becomes more and more relevant from a national power perspective, it seems inevitable to me, if sort of the Chinese government continues to be run in the way that she has run it for the past 15 years, that the sort of operating space for this type of positive sum interaction is gonna shrink.
It feels like there's a real financing gap today in the Chinese ecosystem. And in the US, you've got tons of venture investors, rich capital markets, folks like Nvidia that are, would love to have as many potential model companies that can exist. And it seems like, there's one version of the world where the Chinese government's just happy to let everyone club each other to death, see who the few winners are. Yeah. Obviously, we've seen scaling laws kind of seem to continue to hold up. It feels like this is going to be a capital-intensive game. Do you think that is how it persists, or does the Chinese government step in and try and solve this in some way?
Okay, so let's do a bit of a like net assessment of
love a good net assessment.
Yeah, you got to do it of the Chinese and
I'm sorry to get you a whiteboard to really do it.
So what are the inputs to like have great models that you can deploy at scale? You need talent. China's got as much talent as any other country in the world. You need energy. They probably have enough energy to run that as far as we're going to need to over the next few years. The real constraint is going to be compute. And right now, it seems like the Trump administration has decided to continue the Biden administration policies of not giving the Chinese government the Chinese mainland like as much access to compute as they would want in the interim. So then what we're having a sort of battle on is like whether the sort of Western finance plus TSMC plus like the entire Western supply chain for semiconductor manufacturing equipment will be able to sort of outscale with an enormous like a lead of probably 10x where Huawei is right now, maybe 15, the domestic Chinese ability to sort of copy and scale up the same thing. And you can look at the examples of electric vehicles and the solar industry as moderately difficult emerging technologies that China really has been able to scale up in a way that dwarfs the rest of the world. But I do think that semiconductors are different. Yeah. We have basically had an open tab when it comes to the Chinese government allowing their hardware ecosystem to spend as much as it takes to build it up. And they are where they are today. The Chinese government can spend a lot of money, but global capitalism can spend a whole lot more. I mean, the fact that Alibaba is worth like $200 billion and Nvidia is worth $4 trillion, 5 trillion, all the sort of like swing sources of capital seem to be coming America's way. So there isn't really like cavalry going to come in from a sort of like a technological defector of like, oh, is Japan going to switch sides? I don't really think so. Such that I do feel kind of confident that the money that the West is going to be able to, the money and technology the West is going to be able to deploy to scale up on the compute side is going to be able to swamp the Chinese players for a long time to come.
End of next year, is there going to be like a greater or smaller difference between American and Chinese models?
So the models themselves, who knows? But we've kind of learned this. It's not just the model, it's the ability to serve it, right? And that is really where you start to see these constraints. I mean, like if you think the rate limits on Claude and OpenAI are bad, like just try using a Chinese model, right? And so that both takes compute and it takes money. And look, maybe once the business models start to click in, that starts to change. But as long as you do have this relatively substantive wall not allowing China to buy the best chips in the world from the place who makes 10 times as many as what the Chinese competitor can make, then you've got a big edge. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the gap between closed Western models and Chinese models is going to be all that big. But like in order to reap the sort of gains from a business perspective and from a broader like national productivity growth perspective, like you need to have
like how many tokens does each person get for
exactly. And that's the thing that I think is domestically going to be constrained relative to the West and China for a long time to come.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though. It sounds like the Chinese government is focusing on the exact right area, where it's that like basically opening up capital markets more or putting more money to work without solving this hardware problem is not actually all that helpful. It's like that's the thing that needs to be figured out. You kind of alluded to some of the U.S. government policy, Trump administration continuing some of the stuff, but the Biden administration's done. Can you just give our listeners like a walkthrough of like USAI policy toward China over the last 5-6 years and kind of where we are today?
We're starting 2015, 2016. So late Obama, you have this consensus start to shift in America from the more we engage with them, the more liberal and comfortable we'll be with China's rise in the world, to this understanding that the direction that Xi is taking the Chinese government is not one that the U.S. is going to be comfortable with anytime soon. So starting late Obama, then in Trump 1 and into the Biden administration, you had this sense that China is a strategic competitor. The U.S. just can't let them do whatever they want and gain in every front that we consider to be of like national strategic importance. So there are places that we're going to have to start controlling. Yeah. So, and towards the end of the Trump administration, there was a big focus on telecommunications and Huawei. And when the Biden team came in, thankfully, there were a handful of like pretty pilled folks in the White House in 2021 and 2022 that saw just how important compute was going to be to this sort of new paradigm of competition. So September 2022.
Who were these people? Because I feel like before ChatGPT, it was not like, I wouldn't have expected so many people in the administration to know that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting happenstance. So there are a handful of folks at CSET, Jason Matheny, Ben Buchanan, Chris McGuire, Saif Khan. You should have all these guys on. It'd be great for your show. Have been writing about AI for years, and
they were reading all the research.
They're reading the papers, and they're just like, all right, this could be a big one. So in October 2022, you have
a month before ChatGPT.
A month before ChatGPT, you have this very dramatic move to start to control both exports of AI chips as well as semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And then a month later, we have ChatGPT, and everyone's like, oh. Like at first we're like, oh, this is kind of weird, kind of interesting. And they're like, oh, okay, like I get it. Scaling laws, like here's what we're trying to stop. So there has been there was a dance over the course of the Biden administration where on the one hand, Nvidia wants to sell chips, so they make something that's like right under the limit. And then the government is like, no, that's not cool. The parameters of which manufacturing equipment also got twisted over time. And then they wanted to make sure that the Dutch and the Japanese did it at the same time, so it was kind of delayed. And then you had this big scandal of TSMC basically selling a ton of wafers to a Huawei cutout that then they ended up getting smacked for. So there was this understanding that like, look, we want to win on compute, and one of the ways we're going to win on compute is by throwing some gears in the sand of the Chinese compute ecosystem and not letting them just like buy up everything. And not great. not perfect, not terrible, but like on the margin, definitely slowed down the development of the Chinese semiconductor and broader AI ecosystem. So in comes the Trump administration. The first few months, you had a team that seemed to be very aligned with this view that controls were important. Enter David Sachs. Exit the China Hawks, thanks to Laura Loomer, and in comes Jensen Huang into Trump's life, and we've had this real head-spinning drama of will he or won't he allow the best American chips to sell to China. An interesting wrinkle in this is that the H20s, which are good, not great chip, like one generation behind, kind of limited in some ways, but still very powerful. The Trump administration decided to sell into China, only for the Chinese government to say, "Screw you guys, we don't want your stinking chips." Now, why that happened was a fascinating is a big puzzle that the community is still very much debating. On the one hand, maybe she has bad information and the Huawei lobbyists got in and told them that we've got better chips and more chips than you really think we do. Maybe it's a negotiating ploy to get Blackwell's, instead of this like gimpy knockoff model. And then there was this big drama in the lead up to Trump's summit with Xi in Seoul, where he got on the plane. The stock went up 10% at the expectation that he was going to decide to sell them. And Lutnick and Rubio and Bessent and Davison Greer like all huddled in Air Force One being like, Trump, don't do this. And he comes off the plane and he doesn't sell the chips. But now we have another story that they're considering selling a version of it. So this administration, I think, is definitely of two minds. Of on the one hand, this is an edge that we want to keep. Yeah. On the other hand, maybe there are some upsides to keeping China buying Nvidia chips for a while.
Yeah, I get the argument for not selling them. How would you strawman the argument for selling them?
So the most compelling case that Jensen has is that AI accelerators are not just their hardware, they're the software as well. And the software keeps getting better, partially because, Nvidia and AMD and Huawei themselves invest in their own architectures, and also because there is this broader kind of global community of developers, which is contributing to the ability for CUDA to just like be better than a random chip you get off the shelf that doesn't have the software optimizations. And, there are thousands of very, very good Chinese engineers who wouldn't, who given their druthers would love to stay on NVIDIA because they are the best chips. And by not selling chips into these NVIDIA chips into China, there is a risk that engineering energy instead gets spent on improving the sort of Huawei software ecosystem.
I feel like people have also written about this like ideal Goldilocks scenario where like you give, Chinese companies enough of chips that like they don't spend too much time like building their own. Like I feel like Ben Thompson's written about that and Dylan from Semi Analysis. Is there like a way to stick the landing where it's like you still have most of the of like the cutting edge chips in the US, but like you've given at least enough of an incentive not to like go all in on Huawei and the local ecosystem?
Howard Lutnick said, we want to get them addicted to American chips. And I think this is a story that has played out so many times over the past 30 years that the goal is indigenization, and it's going to come whether you like it or not, whatever your business plan, whatever your China strategy is. If what you're selling is like a nationally important strategic resource, then you are going to have domestic energy, which has been supercharged by the fact that there have been so many export controls, and there have been these choke points that have been raised. People say like, Huawei went from this like second source no one really wants to deal with to like what's front and center. Well, the next administration is only 3 years away. I don't think these companies are stupid. I would almost make an argument to the other side where if you're trying to build a lead, why give them this bridge and this breathing space that selling a lot of chips would provide? Because the sort of, as we talked about before on the hardware ecosystems, like the Chinese hardware ecosystem is not capital constrained. Right. They have all the energy. They have all the attention. They've had more money poured into it than any, it is the biggest industrial policy project in human history. There's been more money poured into it than anything ever. So, they're going to try as hard as they can. And my takeaway is that selling Nvidia chips, particularly into China, not even allowing Chinese firms to rent them in Malaysia or Singapore or on AWS or what have you, the drawbacks don't exceed the benefits. But look, there are a number of unknowns which are in this. This is a very complex sort of equation to pan out. Like, it depends on your assumptions of how good Huawei is going to get. It depends on your assumptions of to what extent, Nvidia is capital constrained. Like, are there, is what's limiting American or sort of Western AI build out compute? Is it energy? Is there more? Would more demand for TSMC actually lead them to make more chips, or are they already kind of tapped out? So I don't know. A lot of variables. It's a complicated thing. The one illustrative point I would make to you is that I have tried, I've done a lot of shows on my podcast about this. I have tried to find an expert that has not, that isn't sort of financially tied to the like Nvidia upside outcome of making the case, and I haven't been able to find that person. So there seems to be a pretty strong consensus among the folks who take this seriously that the balance leans towards not selling them the chips and definitely not selling them the semiconductor export equipment. But there are legitimate arguments on the other side.
Yeah. What is the status quo today of this ban? Like, is it effective? I feel like the Wall Street Journal had some piece about chips getting smuggled in, recently. It feels like you can, rent some of these chips in clouds, maybe in other countries, on the ground for these Chinese firms. Like, are they pretty constrained in their access?
Yeah. I mean, that's the sort of interesting thing about this is there's nothing stopping Chinese firms from renting compute abroad and renting the best chips abroad. That whole lock-in thing I was talking about is these companies are still training their models on Nvidia. They're just doing it in Malaysia or with the chips they already have or the chips that they've already smuggled, because Nvidia is still a lot better than what Huawei has to offer. So the upside of actually legally selling the chips into China, really is just I don't know, a couple, maybe 10, 20, $50 billion more of revenue over a 5-year horizon. But it's unclear to me how much of that money will be marginal money versus money that the Chinese firms are just spending to access.
I thought the Biden diffusion rule had something around
Oh yeah, so that's gone.
Okay, so that's completely gone.
Yeah. We're not doing well. It's interesting because
they were trying to prevent this, right?
Because this is what they were trying to do. I think the Trump administration is less bullish on it, but there's this very weird liminal thing where they issued a rescission. They said in an FAQ from BIS that the diffusion rule doesn't exist, but they haven't actually crossed it out on paper, presumably because there is still an internal fight in the Trump administration of whether or not this diffusion rule is a thing that we're going to live by or not. So yeah. You're asking the right question. A lot of this stuff is TBD. And the thing about the Trump administration, they just change their mind all the time. We're optimizing for vibes. We're optimizing for headlines. The folks who try to project some grand strategic thinking on it, I think are connecting dots that don't actually exist. He's all about sort of internal power struggles and, being this flexible player or something. So I would be shocked if we ended up given how many twists and turns we've had over the past year or, 10 years of Trump, that we'd end up getting real consistency on this thing beyond him saying, okay, AI is important. We want to win in it.
So today, these Chinese firms can access decent amount of compute abroad to train. They presumably, if they had popular products, could run inference on those products abroad. I can't tell how much of a constraint it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, there's some kind of data privacy law stuff with using cloud that's outside China and into China. So that I think is one of actually more of the constraint on the Chinese side as opposed to the American. But yeah, I mean, it's a access to capital compute problem as much as it is the US government isn't letting them have access to Nvidia today.
On the Huawei side, obviously there's technological improvements that need to happen. And then there's also just being able to manufacture at scale, right? And have any sort of demand for it. I realize this is probably a hard question, but do they have a shot? How do you think about that question when you talk to other folks?
Yeah, if you go back to 2020 and 2021, the chips that Huawei were designing and making at SMIC were basically as good as Nvidia's chips. So from a design perspective, they are not lacking in any sense of the word. So it really comes down to the sort of scaling within the Huawei fabs and within the SMIC fabs. And the big constraint that they're operating under is they don't have EUV. So that means that their chips are sort of stuck at 7 nanometer, and you can push it, but like all the technological trees they are going down are ones that all the Western fabs and the broader sort of global ecosystem decided were less efficient, because using EUV lithography to make this stuff was a better mix of like effort and yields and like just capital and technological research allocation. So a lot, one of the big ironies of the Biden administration semiconductor equipment control policy is that semicap basically doubled in 2020 from 2022 to 2023 once they controlled this, because there was this big influx of capital, and folks, the Chinese semiconductor ecosystem sort of saw the writing on the wall, and they're like, oh, we got to hoard both chips as well as manufacturing equipment. There are also still a lot of loopholes where like you can have a subsidiary which is 45% owned. There are some fabs where like one side, like a fab on one side of the street is controlled and the fab on the other side of the street isn't. And there was a big lag in sort of when the controls came on in the US versus in the Netherlands and in Japan. So they do have a lot of equipment in the building, but again, what we're focused on is like the relative amount of compute that Huawei is going to be able to manufacture versus the rest of the world. And the fact is, like, if you look at the Huawei roadmap versus the Nvidia roadmap and the TSMC roadmap, like, I will send you the like infographic I've vibe coded, but it's basically like a 15 to 1 ratio, at least for the next 3 years. There are some knobs.
Ratio of production or?
Compute that is going to be made. And there are some knobs that sort of change that from 15 to 13 to 10 if you kind of make different assumptions about Chinese access to high bandwidth memory, or maybe Huawei gets better at designing this, that, and the other thing. But like, at least for the next 3 years, I mean, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, TBD, but in the near to moderate horizon, like this is a real edge that the Western ecosystem is going to have compared to China's.
Yeah. And I'm struck by about lithography. Like, are we not paying enough attention, sucking up to the Netherlands?
Well, this is the interesting thing, is that because there is an enormous amount of American technology in all of these machines. I mean, ASML like was American. Yeah. There are lots of there are lots of parts which are like fully supplied by the U.S. and like so. I had Jake Sullivan on my podcast a few weeks ago, and the main sort of hypothetical that I got him to engage with was whether or not the U.S. should have done it the hard way as opposed to the nice way, and basically saying, sort of doing a fait accompli with these allies countries selling equipment, saying, sorry, you can't sell anything. Yeah. Because what ended up happening was the Chinese, even though the Chinese firms were not allowed to buy EUV equipment, they spent tens of billions of dollars buying DUV, and that's really what's powering all of this Huawei build out, as well as the legacy chip build out. So there's like a lot of latent power that still exists. Like they can't really say fuck you on this. Yeah. We do hold the cards here, but the Biden administration decided to value the alliances a little more, which led to all of this kind of like frustrating 2-step forward, 1-step back. There was a hope within this community that the Trump administration would put the pedal to the metal on this. And it's like, look, if the Netherlands is worried about America leaving NATO, how worried are, what's one company's like political economy really matter in the grand scheme of things? Same with the Japanese firms. But that's not how it's really played out. And because of the whole rare earths drama between the US and China, it seems like whatever controls that the Trump administration was considering to tighten on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment side are on ice for now.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess if you had the ear of the Trump administration and you could kind of like wave a wand and put one policy forward, like anything that you'd be doing.
So on the export control side, I would say, I want to take it in a slightly different direction. So the Chips and Science Act, which was passed in 2022, led to part of the reason why there's been this whole kind of domestic fab renaissance. Had two parts to it. So one is the kind of loans, grants, tax benefit to R&D tax benefit that has helped build all these fabs in Arizona and Texas. But there's also this R&D component. It was $13 billion to sort of create, like do basic and translational research that would push the frontier of semiconductor manufacturing forward. The Biden administration kind of fumbled the bag on this. They were sort of slow to start spending the money. Yeah. They didn't end up developing a lot of friends within industry. And the Trump administration a few months ago canceled it, or canceled the iteration of the nonprofit that was going to run this that the Biden administration had set up. Now, what's going to happen to that money is TBD. I mean, whether it goes into like just buying stakes in companies because we think that's cool now, whether they try to spin up another version of this, whether it just like ends up being a kind of subsidy to corporate R&D, is an open question. But like, it would be a bummer if the biggest kind of injection of research and development, which if we're looking at like a 10, 20 year horizon, is what is going to matter when it comes to this sort of like semiconductor and broader compute competition. Like I would like that chunks of money at that scale to do basic research do not come around very long, very, very often in the American political system. And I do have hopes that the Trump administration will still come up with some creative and impactful ideas to spend that money.
I'm sure this is not your favorite part of being a China expert, but I imagine I'm contractually obligated to ask you a little bit about Taiwan.
Sure. Let's obviously do it. Only for you, Jacob.
I mean, people often war game a Taiwan blockade, Taiwan invasion. Like, how likely is this in the next decade?
All right. So let's start with the Trump administration, and then we'll do like a 10-year thing. So the American policy towards Taiwan, to defending Taiwan, has been this idea of strategic ambiguity, that like we're not going to commit to Taiwan, that we're going to defend them so they don't, try to reinvade mainland China, which is something Chiang Kai-shek was considering a number of times. And we're not going to tell China what we're going to do to sort of make it clear on one side or the other. The Biden administration and Biden himself said a number of times, yeah, we defend Taiwan, basically, and sort of like ad-libbed. And the Trump administration, there were a number of people, there is a big debate, I think, in that broader like right-wing ferment of to what extent this island is a place that matters for us. I mean, we had Eldridge Colby writing a whole book basically saying America should care about nothing else in the world but Taiwan because it is so important. They make all the chips. This is our way to contain China, what have you. And we have other strains that couldn't give two shits. It's halfway across the world, 20 million people. Like, let's focus on killing, on overthrowing Maduro and like shutting down drug runners. Why are we worried about this country halfway across the world? So, we talked earlier about this worry in the lead up to the South Korea summit that Trump was going to kind of just like fold on AI chip exports to China. There was another big concern that he was going to fold on Taiwan, and you even had articles written from folks in the White House leaking how concerned they were that he would give something big away. Now, look, it's a similar dynamic to Ukraine, where like just because America says we don't want you to fight anymore doesn't mean that the Taiwanese people have no agency in this. But a big it is a big part of the sort of the balance of the past 75 years, which has kept Taiwan free and independent, has been this commitment from the U.S. and from other countries that it would come it would come to Taiwan's defense. So we're seeing a big kerfuffle now. The new Japanese prime minister said the quiet part moderately more out loud than past Japanese prime ministers said, and like now China banned sushi. Now China banned seafood imports from Japan. So this is still a very hot topic. I think he kind of gets it that this would not be great for the US. Like the package that you would need to receive for China in order to sell Taiwan, up a creek is like, I don't even know what would be on the side of that ledger to make it exciting and acceptable for like the American polity or even a president. But that is, I think, a big concern. Another interesting risk factor is Taiwanese domestic politics and how that drives thinking in Beijing. So we've had two DPP presidencies. Two major parties, DPP and KMT. KMT, ironically, this is Chiang Kai-shek's party. The Taiwanese nationalists, but they have now, some like horseshoe theory thing. They're the ones who are much more friendly with Beijing and more open to like rapprochement. DPP, more left wing, and more kind of like not pro-independence, but less comfortable with like bringing more integration between the mainland and Taiwan. So the concern, like the risk factor, is that she gets impatient and doesn't and sort of sees the writing on the wall from an age perspective for him, wants to like end it, and also sort of sees domestic trend lines in Taiwan going in a way where it seems less and less likely that you would have a more political integration between the island and the mainland. And we're gonna, we've had a relative resurgence in KMT, and like the better the KMT does, the less stressed out people are that Beijing is going to overreact, and they're going to want to play like the nicer long game than the sharper short game when it comes to a blockade or what have you. But so anyways, everyone should care more about domestic Taiwanese politics. It's probably the most important variable when understanding these dynamics. But at the end of the day, my take is that Xi himself is not the type of guy that just goes willy-nilly invading places. Like, he has been in power for over a decade now, and I think that is enough. Those are enough data points to show a revealed preference. And for all of the sort of obnoxiousness that we've seen with the Philippines and the Scarborough Shoals, that weird kind of like battle, like hand-to-hand battle in the Himalayas between China and India over COVID, the increasing like encroachments of Chinese fighter jets kind of like dancing in and or out of the of Taiwanese airspace. Like, this is not what you saw from Putin before he invaded Ukraine. Before he invaded Ukraine, he like invaded Georgia, he like invaded Syria, he invaded Ukraine once, and kind of got comfortable with like very dramatic use of military force. So a world where China doesn't like the results of a domestic Taiwanese election and starts to, flirt with or even do something that looks like a blockade is, non-zero. I would put in the single digits if we're looking at over a 5-year span, but they're not stupid, and they understand the downside risks to doing something like this, which could be really, really severe for the Chinese economy and even potentially for the stability of the party. So the risk-reward matrix doesn't make a lot of sense. It didn't make a lot of sense for Putin in February of 2022. So we'll have to see. This is not the thing that's keeping me up at night, though.
Yeah. As you're particularly AGI pilled, it feels like, oh, it's all TSMC, and that's like the big thing. But it turns out there's many factors at play here.
This is the Ben Thompson argument that like if America gets too far ahead, then they'll want to bomb the fabs or bomb the data centers or something. And like, maybe, but hope springs eternal. I think there's at the end of the day, like, the US and China are each going to make up roughly a quarter of the world's GDP over the next 10, 20, 30 years, regardless of demographics, regardless of whether or not China hits a financial crisis. And that is sort of a fact. Maybe if we live in a real sci-fi world where AI means that America grows at 10% and China doesn't get it and they're growing at 1%, we can have another conversation about whether that means they're going to feel like squeezed like Japan felt in, summer and fall of 1941. But that seems a little far-fetched.
Yeah. Is there anything else that's happening either in the Chinese AI ecosystem or China at large that you feel like is really under-discussed in the media today?
Folks are starting to get a sense of the robotics ecosystem. I think it's going to be a real challenge for the West to scale up manufacturing on that. I mean, we've been able to scale up manufacturing of chips. We've been able to do a really remarkable data center build out, even faster than what China has been able to do on that front. But that's different than just like giant manufacturing. And this is a playbook that China, has run a number of times with drones, with electric vehicles. And insofar as manufacturing robots at scale cheaply is something that is going to unlock a lot of the 21st century, then this is something that the sort of broader Chinese ecosystem may end up having a real edge in.
Totally. And one thing I'm struck by is so much of robotics is, about data collection, and it seems like a lot of the stuff is actually already being deployed around China, which like gives you a huge advantage to start gathering data. I think everyone in the U.S. is trying to figure out like the right way to start getting these things out there.
I remember hearing this story for LLMs too, right? I mean, like, okay, like scale's gone. Like we have Mercor that's like doing its thing, right? But it's been an interesting, like the sort of relative weight of compute versus data versus talent in the sort of like AI LLM ecosystem, I think has sort of ebbed and flowed over time.
Totally.
And this is what we were saying with China. This was like in all the like pre-ChatGPT books, everyone's saying, oh, China has so much more data than the West. Like they have all these CCTV cameras, like they have these closed ecosystems. Like, of course they're going to win. So I think the sort of the factors of what is going to really turn robots on is still an open question. And, the relative strength of the US is still models when it comes to the robotics perspective. Now, like having models and having compute means you get to like, on the LLM side means you get to reap all the benefits, but like you need a lot of robots in order to like use those models and use them at scale in a way that, is like financially remunerative for the folks manufacturing them. And if you're sort of dependent on Chinese robots, then TBD. I mean, there's an interesting question of like, is that a comfortable steady state for the West to have a lot of Chinese robots running around America?
I think too many people have watched iRobot to be cool with that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Jacob Hellberg, who's now at the State Department, like tweeting Chinese humanoid robots, like we have to ban them in all caps, like 3 or 4 years ago. So yeah, iRobot's like a thing that now policymakers are now currently indexing on. So you're onto something, Jacob.
Well, no, I feel like the argument that people like to make that the West has a chance is, all these jobs are so much more expensive in the West. Like actually from a business model perspective, how much are you really going to gain deploying these robots like within China relative to what you gain deploying them in the US? And so the economic prize may end up being so much larger here that enough of an incentive to overcome some of the manufacturing disparities. Jordan, it's been a fascinating conversation. I always like to end our interviews with some quick fire questions where we stuff some overly broad things into the end. And so maybe to start, if you could clone yourself and have your clone go just spend a ton of time digging into other areas, what are some like unexplored topics that you're super excited about?
Dude, Medicare policy. What I thought we were going
to come on the healthcare podcast.
Healthcare podcast.
All right, I would love to have your clone on my healthcare podcast.
Great. That's a really good question. I think something I have been spending time on is thinking more about military applications of AI, and the sort of fact is that what can be certain is that the sort of armies are not going to, or just militaries and national security establishments more broadly are not going to be like perfectly fit for the technological moment whenever the next big war comes. And sort of if you just look at the amount of change that you've seen from the way like battles are fought in Ukraine from 2022 to today, you've had radically different sort of like configurations and relative importance of different weapon systems and what humans are doing and what drones are doing. And that's not because we've had like incredible technological breakthroughs over the past 3 years. It's just that sort of from a doctrinal perspective, from a manufacturing and scaling perspective, from a command and control perspective, there's this enormous amount of technological overhang that organizations, both military as well as like enterprise, are going to have to explore in order to like really make the most of what's out there. And from an enterprise perspective, like you have that creative destruction happening constantly all the time, right? So you reach the frontier of what's possible much quicker and without as much death. But that's not the case with militaries that really sort of like play in the dark for a while, and all of a sudden like the lights are turned on and you're running around being like, oh my God, okay, like now we have 10 times more people than we had a week ago. We have all this energy, this talent, we have all this money, and we have this competitive pressure of like us screwing up and people dying because of it. And that drives an enormous amount of change and churn and innovation, both at the technological as well as the organizational level. So I've been really enjoying kind of reading the case histories of this, because this has happened a lot of other times in history where all of a sudden 1914, like the machine gun, which had been around for 50 years, like was not relevant at the scale that it was, in the Western Front in World War I. And you had lots of different organizations all trying to adapt and train their people and do procurement and like, have all these sort of counter reactions to this like incredible dance, that incredible like death dance of innovation that the sort of two opposing forces of opposing armies had done. So exploring that, it feels today like we're in this moment that's never happened before, because none of us have lived through one of these like, changes not seen in a century from a technological perspective that are going to, ripple through both corporate, commercial, societal, as well as military cases. But going back and, living in that like 1914 moment, that 1941 moment, even the sort of like Gulf War kind of like precision revolution moment has been a fun intellectual exercise. I have a book I will pitch to your audience.
Please do.
It's called The Social History of the Machine Gun. It's 200 pages long, written by John Ellis, who is this like recluse who like refused to come on my podcast. Apparently he hasn't talked to anyone in like 30 years or something. I asked,
that would be a big get if you got it.
I know. I asked like 4 people and they're just like, Jordan, it's not you, it's him. He's just very cantankerous. But he wrote sort of the story of the machine gun very concisely from a lot of different layers. So from this sort of like technological advancement layer of like how you actually came up with this and manufactured it at scale, the acquisition layer of how these who was trying to sell it, how the buyers were thinking about it, and how that changed over time, the sort of tactical layer of like people having this big thing and like figuring out how to position it, and then the sort of broader organizational layer of the militaries of what they're going to do with this technology and like how it's going to end up like changing like battle plans and ultimately grand strategy. It's an incredible case study because like you'd think they would have gotten it faster, but there is just so much like institutional crud. And by the way, it was not obvious. Like there were people who were right, but the people who were wrong, like weren't total idiots. And you could tell a story on the other side of it. And it's the book is great. It's just like this very efficient way to sort of put yourself in the world in which this like giant kind of revolution was going to come and take away like tens, even like hundreds of thousands of lives, but the world couldn't see it. And TBD on like what that is going to be for robots, for AI, for drones, what have you. But it's always good to be reminded that like this is not a unique thing that has ever happened in human history. Like we've hit like technology shock many times in the past.
No, I mean, I feel like the Spanish Civil War was like a famous example, right, of everyone looking around, seeing what was happening there, and then adapting those techniques.
Yeah, looking up. Oh, bombers. Like, oh, okay, got to deal with that. Yeah, so there's a great example of like American generals watching the Crimean War in the 1850s, and then the Civil War breaks out, and the ones who had been in Crimea were got closer to realizing that they couldn't all line up like it was 1807 and Napoleon, and we needed to sort of like spread out because the rifles had gotten that much better. So you can get glimpses into the future, but not all the lessons are applicable. And it's just this incredibly difficult, like knotty thing, which is impossible, but there are some kind of principles which I think you can take out of it, of just how confident you're going to be, what is noise, what is signal, like, and how you sort of build to make sure you're resilient into different potential futures that could play out.